It's good to be back in the studio. I've been away for a couple of weeks.
Welcome back, Anoosh.
Yeah, I think one of our listeners said that I must be sunning myself in Marbella. I was actually in Armenia and Georgia, so I was in the former Soviet bloc. I was not on a beach in Marbella, but it was very nice, and I do recommend it. Rachel, you're back too. You've been away as well.
Yes, yeah. I'm still recovering from the Great North Run on Sunday. So
congratulations.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if that's the right word for it. But
Well, you started your recovery by going to the TUC conference.
yeah, baptism of fire. Yeah.
And you wrote a really good piece on Angela Rayner's speech there. Can you tell us a bit about what you learned?
Yeah, I mean, well, overall, the sort of gathering, the TUC is like the umbrella body for various trades unions. And it was kind of a very disciplined affair. You know, I think the sort of atmosphere overall was that the trade union movement very much wants a Labour government and is not going to be problematic for the current regime. But the sort of the interesting moment, the big kind of set-piece political event was a speech from Angela Rayner, the deputy leader. And this is after she kept responsibility for the New Deal for Workers in Starmer's reshuffle earlier this year. Big boost for her as an individual politician in that she's kind of like the trade union movement's favourite daughter now. You know, she's...
she was introduced as one of us, wasn't
yes, she was introduced as one of us, and she kind of sort of did a lot of the sort of Gordon Brown, Tony Blair win list of all the things that she was offering the trade union movement. The sort of timing of what she's offering is interesting. So, you know, first 100 days, they're going to bring forward the Labour government will bring forward an employment rights bill. There are a few things that may be missing from that, but that's kind of been ironed out and is in line with what trade unions were expecting now. Okay. But I think just the treatment of the deputy leader during the entire conference was that you're one of us, and if it goes wrong, we'll make it a problem for you, or we'll make it a problem for the leader. So they're kind of putting her. That was the vibe.
So a little bit tense.
Yeah, she's very much being put upon their shoulders, and that's kind of could be a problem, but also a massive boost for her politically and whatever her future ambitions may be.
Well, it's interesting because if they're sort of clinging on to Rayner as their hope to deliver the things that they want, that's very representative of this New Deal for Workers. This is the thing that, you know, when you speak to people perhaps on the union side or on the leftier side of Labour, will say, well, we've still got this. And actually, in August, during the National Policy Forum, there were reports that these policies that they were saying they were committing to were actually going to be watered down. Yeah. And so, you know, there is a bit of tension over this policy prospectus, even though it's the one that people, you know, think is the radical remaining kernel of what Labour are offering.
When you think about many of the other things that trade union wants, they all involve spending.
Yeah.
And as we know, Rachel Wearmouth's not going to do any of that. So that they're getting new rights, various different areas, you know, a ban on 0 hours contracts, though I'm not sure how that's going to work considering how many people at Labour councils are employed on 0 hours contracts, for example. So they've got a rollout of rights, which is the quid pro quo for being more accepting of the manifesto and of the National Policy Forum document.
Yeah, okay. And for any of our listeners who have missed this was a prospectus of new workers' rights that was actually set out in 2021. And it's kind of been re-announced. Sometimes it's been kept quiet for a bit and then, brought back to the fore. So this is banning 0 hours contracts, as you mentioned, Rachel, outlawing bogus self-employment, basic rights from day one, so like flexible working as a day one right, sectoral fair pay agreements starting with social care. But actually, some of the suggestions over the summer was that some of these would actually be consulted on beforehand rather than introduced in those first 100 days. And there was also a suggestion that probationary periods would be protected rather than introducing some of these rights from day one, as was promised.
Yeah, the Labour Party have basically said that once they get in, it is a priority, but they want to have this review, this consultation. In part, that's a reflection of the fact that they want to keep business on side. They don't want to go into office with a big string of policies that business aren't aware of. Okay, I don't think that's necessarily going to dilute the policy entirely. It's not uncommon to have reviews. You could say it's a bit of a stop to business, which it is in many ways. But as you said, it's still one of the more radical aspects of Labour policy at the moment. I think once you get into the details of it, there are some questions over, for instance, will they have the money to institute the sectoral pay deals? The one that they've said they're going to start with is on social care. and I think we're going to talk about this in tomorrow's podcast, but social care is broadly paid for via local governments. So is the Labour central government going to give local governments more money to actually give the people in social care a pay rise? Angela Rayner was asked about this on Tuesday on Sky News, and she basically said that it actually makes more sense for us to give people a pay rise because it'll help with worker retention, it will ease the burden on the NHS. So it was very much the rhetoric, invest to save in the long term. That's not something you're necessarily hearing from Rachel Reeves's office at the moment, so I think there's an incompatibility there. Angela Rayner is definitely right on that. I mean, it's something we've spoken about before often, is the false economy of austerity, and you're seeing that in the RAC scandal at the moment. So there are some debates over spending and how much money they have, but many of the changes that they want to bring about are free. So that's why they're so popular. That's why the union's on board. But Rachel, I thought your piece was great, and I wanted to ask about how important that trade union support is going into office.
How important is the support for Labour?
Yeah, that unity between Labour and the trade union movement.
Well, it's important in that a lot of people who will do the door knocking, the activists, will be, trade union members also. But there's a political calculation within those at the top of unions and how they interact with individual politicians. It can make life really difficult when it comes to conference or the big set pieces that the party does. So yeah, quite important, and just quite important culturally for the party. But I think some of the things that are most important to them that are not talked about enough perhaps are things like access to the workplace for unions. That helps unions be able to recruit, helps them to survive in the longer term. So
which lots of other countries have, Australia, New Zealand.
But how important? Very important, but not completely crucial.
I think it's interesting, the narrative over the summer, what you were saying, Anoosh, because there was some donation figures released, and it basically showed that private donors have started giving Labour a lot more money, and the narrative then was that it insulates Labour from the influence of the trade unions because they can rely on private individuals. I'm not sure that's necessarily true. As you say, trade unions are central to the party. They're on the NEC. I remember there was a great anecdote from John McTernan, who was Tony Blair's political secretary, about when New Labour were looking at whether they could introduce Sunday trading hours. And John McTernan, Tony Blair, massive majority, never really got on with the unions. John McTernan, who is this person in Number 10 who communicates with the unions, goes and speaks to the General Secretary of Ustor, who says, no, you can't do that. John McTernan goes into Tony Blair's office in Number 10 and they both go, right, well, we can't do that then. So there is a lot of influence that still remains, that even if they have a big majority.
Yeah, I mean, they represent their workers ultimately.
Yeah. And they back individual candidates as well.
They back individual candidates.
Campaigning in seats that are vital to win, then you do need that union.
They play a huge role in selections. So, unions will want certain people that they want in certain seats or what have you. But I think the sort of interesting word that you use there is that the Labour is currently relying on some private donations, but the deals that they've got with unions are kind of like subs and will arrive no matter what because of their affiliation. So it's a kind of like a long-term funding deal, which would be a bigger problem. So if you have a future leader who is more like a Jeremy Corbyn or what have you, and that's not the party does not become as attractive to the voter or to a private donor, then they can still rely on that long-term relationship that they've got with unions. And the unions founded the party, so it has cultural meaning for some of the people elected at councils and at MP level.
Yeah, and I'd like to ask, actually, Rachel, sorry, this has become a bit of a you ask Rachel situation, but how important is Angela Rayner's and Keir Starmer's relationship to the likelihood that these commitments will be stuck to if Labour get into office?
The timing's important. I heard 100 days like so many times there. They want these things to happen fast, but I think at the same time there's a level of realism that some of the things that they want will be quite difficult to introduce. Banning 0 hours contracts being one of them, sectoral bargaining being another very difficult area, not just because of the economics but because of how the economy is currently organised. It's a complicated calculation, I think, is the best way to answer that question. So if Starmer does something else that the unions don't like in a different part of their policy, this will be a thing that they brought up and said they were promised, and that's something that will unite the union movement around other issues potentially.
And of course, Rayner was delivering this speech in her new role in Shadow Cabinet. She's now Shadow Levelling Up Secretary. How much does that affect, the things that she's publicly talking about now and her standing in the Shadow Cabinet as well?
Yeah, so she replaced Lisa Nandy in that role, and this was the first public appearance that she's made since the reshuffle. It was interesting. She did mention levelling up quite a few times within the speech, which made me think, are Labour now going to conflate levelling up with employment market reforms? Because if they are, then their definition or conception of levelling up is just growing by the day. I think they've basically started including the Green Prosperity Plan, devolution. If it's now labour market reforms as well, it's basically everything and therefore nothing. So I think that wasn't necessarily a good sign for levelling up. It isn't what Boris Johnson, or not Boris Johnson obviously, but people around Boris Johnson meant when they started talking about levelling up. Levelling up was about redressing regional inequalities. Labour and market reforms are really important and a way of redressing the economy, but they're not necessarily regional-based reforms. So I thought that was an interesting part. But then also she's got this broad role as Shadow Levelling Up Secretary. The big question for me is that a vote of confidence in the concept of levelling up? Will Keir Starmer retain the department, or will it just revert back to what it is? Because remember, the Levelling Up department is just the Housing, Communities, Local Government department. It's had 100 names over time, but they could just drop the whole phrase and she would still have that sort of base of policies that she's responsible for. So there's lots of questions. I mean, it is just a name, but it's also a big policy agenda which represents a big shift in politics in the past 5 years. It's epitomised by Brexit in 2019 that said actually people are a bit sick with the economy being so focused in London and the southeast. So people just dismiss it as a slogan. I do think it does capture a very important policy agenda. Will Labour carry that through? I'm not sure yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting if they are trying to tie it into these employment rights or worker sort of regulation changes, because it ties into something that we've spoken about before, which is what can Labour introduce that's free? Yeah. And obviously, aside from, paying public sector workers more in these sectorial bargaining agreements, some of this stuff is sort of technically free, though it will have an impact on businesses and that has, implications for tax revenue and things. But it is regulatory change. And so it's sounds like transformative policy that doesn't have a huge price tag attached to it. So in a way, maybe it's quite useful for them to redefine levelling up through some of these things like devolution and workers' rights that don't necessarily require huge funding commitments. But like you say, it takes it away from that original definition. And I think the one that Lisa Nandy, the previous person in that position, was a bit more attached to. I think her and Michael Gove had a bit of a rapport on levelling up, didn't they? They were kind of trying to one-up each other, but using the same definition. I mean, they even had the same advisor.
Yeah. I mean, it might be good for Labour. It's not very good for levelling up.
Yes.
The big question is, I think at the moment, is Labour going to follow through on Northern Powerhouse Rail? Is it going to go through Bradford? Are they going to stick with HS2 as well? That's something that reports of the weekend have suggested the government are considering dropping. There are big infrastructure projects that are much better definitions of levelling up than labour market reforms.
Yeah, and we were talking to someone sort of who's on the inside who's seen a bit of this the other day, who was saying that they thought that levelling up was dead in the water, weren't they?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Rachel, what do you think?
I thought it was interesting that she sort of made some new links when talking about it. Yeah, she was sort of good unionised jobs, levelling up was equivalent to creating good unionised jobs. And I think she told a little bit about her own story. She kind of wants to use the role to kind of be face of social mobility for the Labour Party. I think having housing is the big prize for Angela Rayner politically.
She grew up in a council house. She is now shadow housing.
Yeah, and she made a very important distinction that yes, that includes council housing. Yes. You know, she was very
clear before, I don't think.
She was very specific about that. So it wasn't just purely an aspiration. We'll help you to buy your own home. It was, she put social housing right at the centre of it there, which I thought were two interesting distinctions and a bit departure from her predecessor, even though the
Yeah.
two are very close politically.
Yeah, and we know that planning reform is going to be central to what they do in the first year or so of government. If Angela Rayner can take the lead on that and take the credit for it, then that would be great for her positioning within the party. It was noticeable watching the speech. I thought that that she has a lot of authority now in a way that other shadow cabinet members don't necessarily have, in part because she's got this base within the party because she's deputy leader. But I also thought at the TUC, base within the trade union movement was something I'm sure lots of shadow cabinet members were envious of.
I think that's probably true. Yeah, I think they're probably... Angela Rayner's team is very happy with the reshuffle.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.